In the early 13th century, the Baltic frontier in Central Europe remained a hostile and uninviting place. Pagan Europeans far outnumbered Christians, and the area was a focal point for constant conflict between mutually exploitive neighbors slavering to carve out new territorial holdings at the expense of anyone who stood in their way. During this period, two major outside forces came into play. One was the zealous Teutonic Order, German-born warrior knights who considered it a holy crusade to subdue and vanquish the pagans, and the Russians, too, for good measure. The other force was the Mongols, Asian nomads who first had invaded Western Europe in 1223, advancing all the way to the gates of Vienna in 2 short decades before heading back home upon the death of their great leader, Ogadai, son of Genghis Khan. The indigenous people inhabiting the Baltic frontier spoke various languages, from Baltic in the south to Finnish in the north. Exotic and mystifying, they were a source of morbid fascination to more westernized Europeans. Traveling monk Adam of Bremen wrote of the Balts in the 11th century, "They worship serpents and birds and also sacrifice to them live men whom they buy from merchants." They fought continually, raiding their neighbors in Scandinavia and Russia in search of women, loot, and slaves. Theirs was an inhospitable land whose brutal weather made lengthy campaigns difficult. The weather was acceptable only for brief periods from May through June and August through September. Winter was actually a better time for campaigning. The dense forests were impossible to traverse, but frozen rivers, lakes, and streams could be crossed easily when iced over. The trouble with Russia had begun a dozen years earlier, in 1224, when some overly aggressive crusaders had captured the Russian fortress of Tartu in Estonia. The leader of the attacking crusaders, Albert von Buxtehude's brother, proceeded to kill all but one of the Russian garrison. The new conflict was shaping up not simply as a contest for land, but as a deadly fight over religious affiliation as well. A great deal of tension between the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches had been in evidence since well before the First Crusade. One focal point of this tension was the northern Russian city of Novgorod, which had long been an important trading center, well set up for commercial success but not in a strong position defensively. Trading in furs, fish, and even ivory from walrus tusks taken in the frozen north, Novgorod's population shared a common language and religion, and its leaders had set up a number of buffer zones among neighboring tribes to protect the city from outside invaders. But in 1223 the Mongols arrived on the scene, and Novgorod soon became dependent on Western Europe for survival. Novgorod itself was spared from invasion by an early spring thaw, which halted the Mongols 100 miles from the gates of the city. This was welcome news to the people of Novgorod and their untested leader, Prince Alexander Nevsky. Hoping to exploit the Russians' weakness in the wake of the Mongol and Swedish invasions, the Teutonic Knights attacked the neighboring Novgorod Republic and occupied Pskov, Izborsk, and Kopri in the autumn of 1240. When they approached Novgorod itself, the local citizens recalled to the city 20-year-old Prince Alexander Nevsky, whom they had banished to Pereslavl earlier that year. During the campaign of 1241, Alexander managed to retake Pskov and Kopri from the Crusaders. In the spring of 1242, the Teutonic Knights defeated a detachment of Novgorodians about 20 kilometers south of the fortress of Dorpat. Led by Prince Bishop Hermann of Dorpat, the Knights and their auxiliary troops of local Ugonian Estonians then met with Alexander's forces by the narrow strait that connects the northern and southern parts of Lake Peipus on April 5, 1242. Alexander, intending to fight in a place of his own choosing, retreated in efforts to draw the often overconfident Crusaders to the frozen lake. Most of the knights were Germans, but not all. Many had joined for the prestige and honor of fighting with the order. They also were well taken care of by their leaders. At the top of the order were the brethren, or brothers. There were perhaps 100 of these brothers, along with their retainers, in the immediate area who could respond to a sudden call to arms. Other knights were referred to as seasonal crusaders, or summer warriors, many of them out for pillage and excitement. For them, the war provided a way to salvation without a long trek to the Holy Land. These seasonal crusaders, and their retainers numbered perhaps 800. Along with the mounted knights were regiments of foot, including perhaps 400 Germans, 300 Danes, and up to 1,000 Estonians and Swedish mercenaries. Some of these troops, notably the Germans, were well trained and armored, many with crossbows, spears, and shields. The remaining forces were mostly levies of local men fighting for pillage and even sex, rape being a prerogative of the winners, who would capture and carry off any women accompanying the enemy. Some of these locals would serve as light or skirmish cavalry, scouting and foraging as well as guarding the flanks of the army. Tactics were centered on a thunderous attack by wedging knights supported by massed missile fire. The rest of the army would support the knights. In all, the Crusader army likely numbered between 2,000 to 2,500 men. The Russian army was even more diverse than the Crusaders. At the top were the military elite, tribal aristocrats of the old ruling order Scandinavian mercenaries. These men had with them their followers and retainers, called druzina. These men were service-bound, not land-bound as most of feudal Europe was at this time. Perhaps 1,000 of them were armored and fought mounted. With the military elite came both urban and rural peasant militiamen and tribesmen fighting for love of country, loyalty to their leader, or for their Eastern Orthodox faith. With an estimated strength of between 3,000 and 4,000 men, it was the biggest contingent in the army. The men were unarmored but still very useful troops, providing needed bulk and archers to the Russian armies. Finally, there were a number of horse archers, 500 mercenaries in alliance with the Russians against the Crusaders. The total army numbered about 6,000 men. Russian tactics were basically defensive in nature. A typical use of available forces would have the numerous Russian archers fire at an advancing enemy, weakening them as they came close. The foot soldiers would absorb the initial attacks. Whether they held or not was impossible to predict, but this would spare the valuable druzina for a devastating counterattack against a hopefully tired and disorganized enemy. The horse archers and skirmish cavalry, armed with composite bows, would begin to shoot before their opponent's arrows could reach them. As one observer, Friar Carpini, noted, they begin to shoot before their opponent's arrows can reach them, sometimes even ahead of the time when they are not in range. As soon as their arrows can reach the mark unhindered, they are said, owing to the density of their shooting, to rain arrows rather than to shoot them. When the Crusaders mustered their forces and closed in on the raiding Russian army, Alexander purposefully fled. It was late March, and ice still remained in the Russian streams and rivers. As the Russians fled back to their homeland, the Crusaders had their first victory. They managed to cut off and ambush a force of Russians separated from the main army, destroy it, and force the survivors to flee for their lives to the main army. Alexander didn't panic, he knew his men. They would fight well when the time came. The Russian army fell back to the area of gigantic Lake Peipus, the fourth largest lake in Europe. Lake Peipus was still frozen over, but with an uneven surface. The ice was thick enough for infantry and lighter cavalry to cross. It was not all that deep in many places, with little difficulty. Here, the Russian prince showed his innate knowledge of both the enemy and the terrain. He formed his army, not on the lake itself but on the shore, where he could face the attacking enemy as it stumbled to cross the ice. The numerous Russian archers were stationed in the center of the northern edge of the army, with the horse archers on the right flank to counter the Teutonic Order, which rode in the center of the Crusader army. Crusader allies were positioned on the right flank, Danes and Estonians to the left, and auxiliaries to the rear in support. The heavily armored knights formed the spearhead of a column followed by light cavalry and foot, which charged into the Russian infantry. Alexander and the men of Novgorod drew up their forces by the lake, at Usman, by the Raven's Rock, and the Germans and Estonians rode straight at them, driving themselves like a wedge through their own army. The Crusaders wasted no time in attacking the Russians. The battle began with a bold assault from Teutonic knights. The Teutonic knights charged forward, their banners flying in the wind as they crashed into the ranks of the Russian militia. The sound of swords clashing against shields and helmets echoed across the frozen lake. The Russian spear militia fought bravely, forming a shield wall to withstand the initial charge. They thrust their spears forward, trying to penetrate the heavy armor of the Teutonic knights. But the knights were well-trained and experienced fighters, and they easily parried the spears with their shields. The Crusaders had a clear plan in mind: kill or capture the Russian leader. They knew that without their prince, the Russian army would lose command and control, and would be easier to defeat. The German knights trying to break through the Russian lines and reach their target. The Russian center reeled and fell back under the force of the Crusader mounted attack, but this time the men did not break. They stood their ground, fighting fiercely against the Teutonic knights. The battle raged on for hours, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. As the knights were fully engaged with spear militia, Prince Nevsky unleashed his fierce Turkish mercenary horse archers upon the unsuspecting Danish wing of the Teutonic Army. The horse archers, skilled in the art of hit-and-run tactics, began to move around the Crusaders, firing arrows with deadly precision from a distance that the Crusaders couldn't reach. The Danes were left in shock, unable to respond to the barrage of arrows raining down upon them. The Crusaders soon realized that they were facing an enemy they could not catch nor defeat in traditional hand-to-hand combat. The horse archers continued to pick off their targets, taking down the Danish soldiers one by one. The sounds of clanging swords and battle cries were replaced by the whistling sound of arrows as they flew through the air. The Estonians and Danes either died in their tracks or began to run away madly, seeking any escape from certain death. Once this occurred, the vastly superior Russian army began to outflank the outnumbered Crusaders. At first, the Crusaders were successful, their initial charge dislodging the Russian ranks and creating gaps in their formation. However, as the knights continued to push forward, they found themselves bogged down in the heavy fighting along the shoreline. The Russian footmen, though outnumbered, were fiercely determined to defend their land and their people. They stood their ground, their spears bristling like a forest of steel, as the knights smashed into their ranks. The Crusaders hacked and slashed with their swords and wielded their lances with deadly precision, but the Russian numbers began to tell. As the battle raged on, the Crusaders grew more and more exhausted, their heavy armor and weapons weighing them down. The Russian footmen, on the other hand, were nimble and agile, able to move quickly across the icy terrain. They used their superior numbers to their advantage, encircling the Crusaders and striking at them from all sides. Despite their bravery and determination, the Crusaders began to tire quickly. The slippery ice and the weight of their armor made it difficult for them to maneuver, and many were pulled from their horses as they stumbled along the shoreline. The Russian footmen seized upon this weakness, using their spears to trip up the knights and drag them down into the freezing waters of the lake. At this very moment the Russian prince ordered his elite fearsome cavalry, the Druzina, to attack. The fresh and eager horsemen charged forward with such ferocity that caught even the Crusaders off guard. The Germans and their allies quickly realized the dire situation they were in as they found themselves surrounded by the Russian forces. The fighting grew increasingly desperate as the Crusaders fought for survival, their swords clashing with the spears and axes of the Russian cavalry. Despite their best efforts, the Crusaders were slowly being pushed back towards the shoreline. The Russian forces, bolstered by their superior numbers and fresh troops, were beginning to overwhelm the exhausted Crusaders. The open flank that the horse archers had cleared provided the perfect opportunity for the Russian cavalry to outflank and surround the Crusaders, leaving them with no escape route. As the fighting continued, the Crusaders began to fall beneath the blades of the victorious Russians. Despite their dire circumstances, the Crusaders did not panic. They continued to fight with all their might, hoping to somehow turn the tide of the battle. However, their efforts were in vain. The Russian forces continued to press forward, pushing the Crusaders closer and closer to the shoreline. Then, suddenly, the morale and courage of the Crusaders faltered. In a moment of panic, they broke ranks and ran. The Russian forces chased after them, cutting down any Crusaders who were unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. The Crusader infantry was also not lucky. Some 400 of the Germans were killed and another 50 were taken prisoner. There were also 20 elite Teutonic knights died that day. The bloody personal combat can be verified by the fact that only 6 of them were actually taken prisoner, this at a time when high ransoms were paid for valuable prisoners. The legacy of the battle, and its decisiveness, rests in that it halted the eastward expansion of the Teutonic Order and established a permanent border line of the Narva River and Lake Peipus dividing Eastern Orthodoxy from West Catholicism. The Knights' defeat at the hands of Alexander's forces prevented the Crusaders from retaking Pskov, the linchpin of their Eastern Crusade. The Novgorodians succeeded in defending Russian territory, and the German Crusaders never mounted another serious challenge eastward. Alexander was canonized as a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church in 1574.